I'd like to introduce our next guest now, Dr. Erin Michalak. Dr. Michalak is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry, at UBC, and she's the founder of that long organization that I mentioned earlier, but I'll say it again, it's crest.bd. You may all have seen it, but I just discovered it, so I recommend you go take a look. Her research interests are bipolar disorder, quality of life, knowledge translation, so sharing information with others in a way that they can understand it and ingest it, digest it, self-management, e-health, seasonal and non-seasonal depression, and assessment scales for mood disorders. And in her spare time, she is an avid mushroom hunter. Yes, I have no idea, but you heard me right. And a breeder of giant schnauzers, where she lives in the Sunshine Coast of BC. And she's here really to share some impactful stories that she's heard along the way about social stigma in community. Please welcome Dr. Erin Michalak.
Thank you, Maria. I kind of feel like I'm walking in the shadow of giants, standing up here now after those two incredible opening presentations. I'm going to change pace a little bit. One of the things that we really wanted to make sure that we did with this Me Too speaker series was leave you with concrete tools that you could take home to use in your own lives to combat stigma, and some knowledge of the research evidence and where we're going with that. And so that's really the thrust of the presentation that I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be sharing, I don't have enough time to share all the resources I want with you verbally. So the way we're going to do this is they will be concurrently released on Twitter, if you're on Twitter now. On Instagram, we'll be doing a bit of work through our Facebook page. And the website address that you can see at the bottom, on Monday, we'll have a document uploaded to it, which will be a compilation of all the resources that the speakers have spoken about tonight. So don't feel like you have to scribble this down quickly as we go, and I'm also happy to share the slides with you afterwards. So I'm talking about social stigma this evening. You have a pretty theoretical definition in the one-page handout that you have about how we understand social stigma from a kind of a research perspective. We've been studying lived experiences of stigma in CREST BD for a number of years now. And for me, the most powerful quote I've ever come across that encapsulates experiences of stigma comes from a woman that we interviewed about 8 or 9 years ago. And she was describing the experiences that she encountered from her family members and from her community when her daughter had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And this is what she said: if my child had leukemia, you would all be bringing me lasagna right now. And that really brings it home for me, how we treat physical conditions differently from mental health conditions. This is going to be the thrust of my talk today. I'm going to focus on what I'm kind of describing as the 3 C's that are embedded within social stigma. I'm going to talk about communication, contact, and a little bit on political correctness, which Victoria brought up earlier on as well. Let's start with contact. This is one of my giant schnauzers, and Chica, the kitten. Contact-based approaches in mental health stigma reduction essentially are based on the premise that we need to bring people together with diverse expertise and essentially humanize experiences. Of all of the stigma intervention techniques, contact-based interventions are probably one of the ones with the most promise. Victoria did a couple of readings earlier from a play that we developed called, or she developed it and we tested it essentially, called That's Just Crazy Talk, which you may have heard of before. This is really interesting. This is done with government funding. We're lucky to be in Canada. In Canada, our healthcare funding agencies are quite innovative about funding us to test out whether we can use methods like the arts to shift stigma. This is a product of a study like that. And essentially, we got funding for a 2-year project to test out whether a new one-woman solo performance, That's Just Crazy Talk, could shift attitudes, negative attitudes, towards people with bipolar disorder in 2 groups: people with bipolar disorder themselves, and then the healthcare providers of people with bipolar disorder. Victoria developed the play, and then we performed it. She performed it across 3 research test test cases, essentially, a couple in Vancouver, one in Toronto, and we evaluated the impact of the performance on attitudes of the audience members. 2 other studies also evaluated the impact of the play in its filmed version. So we produced a DVD with it, and we also wanted to know if you couldn't clone Victoria and move her live around the country constantly, can we also use a filmed version of that performance to shift stigma? And the answer basically is yes. We're concurrently sharing all the resources and the papers with you right now so that you can look at that in more depth. What's interesting about the headline results from that study is that actually the performance was more impactful in healthcare providers than it was in people with lived experience. We have a number of theories for why that happened. But you can see a quote at the bottom from one of the interviews we did with people, a person who had seen it. This is a healthcare provider quote, and she said, "I think it's just something that reminded me that they're just like you and me. They're just a person who has a story." There are many other contact-based approaches that you could take and embed in different settings. If you're a clinician, in a clinician setting. If you're running a peer support group, in a peer support setting. The best place for you to go to find out about those that are evidence-based, that have been tested and are effective, is the Mental Health Commission of Canada. The MHCC has a very innovative anti-stigma program called Opening Minds. And if you go to that section of the website there, you'll find a list of all the school-based, clinical-based, contact-based stigma interventions that the MHCC and other groups have tested out and found have impact. So we'll be sharing that resource with you as well. Moving on to the idea of communication, this is an interesting study. Actually, it's a little bit older. It's from 2010. It's not one of ours. It comes from the substance use literature. And basically, what was done here was about 700 people, clinicians who were coming into a conference, were showed 2 vignettes. You can see those up on the right-hand side. They're 2 descriptions of a patient who's experiencing substance use problems. There's only one difference between those 2 vignettes. One uses the term person with a substance abuse problem. The other one uses the term substance abuser. And then they looked at the audience afterwards and surveyed these clinicians about things like, what do you think were the causes of this person's mental health problems? Do you think that they should be treated differently according to these 2 vignettes? Are they personally culpable for their condition? And should they have punitive action? So, for example, one of the questions in the questionnaire was something around, I think that the judge should send them to jail to teach them a lesson. It was pretty hard language, right? People in the substance abuser condition were significantly more likely to think that that person was either personally responsible for their substance misuse problem and that they should receive punitive action. Language has incredible power, right? I'm going to touch on this one very briefly. We've talked about first-person language. We've talked about not using terms like psycho. This is one that we could all drive down on, that we still see very frequently. It hasn't been a crime in the UK to commit suicide since the Suicide Act of 1961. This is something that we see a lot in the media, and it's the kind of, more of a, in terms of sensitivity and driving down and stigma reduction, there are lots of more nuanced areas of language that we could all really be bearing down on together. There are fabulous resources to point people to. The media, for example, workplace environments, when you do see language that you find offensive like this being used. Mindframe and MindCheck, which are US and Canadian organizations, and also the American Psychiatric Association, are producing beautiful documents online that we can send people to think about, and to do some of the work for them about finding better alternative language. And this is where I end, and really I'm throwing out what I thought I was going to say around political correctness and just bounce off a couple of the points made by previous speakers. Victoria talked about the idea of using teachable moments, and Maria opened this meeting talking about this being a safe space. I'm a huge fan of political correctness. I think you might have got that idea by now, but I do think there's an incredible danger of being so rapidly politically correct that we're shutting down conversations, that we're missing opportunities to try to create spaces that are safe for people that don't think like we do. We're mostly of like minds in this room. I challenge you, I challenge us as a community that if we want to shift social stigma, that I think what we need to do collectively is maybe be the bigger person, to go into those somewhat less safe spaces, to try to show compassion, to remember that not everybody who's using stigmatizing languages is doing it because they're a bigot. Sometimes they're a bit ignorant or ill-educated or young or naive. And this all won't always work, but to think about being the bigger person and trying to create an environment for conversation rather than for one of another kind of stigmatization and degradation. That was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to just remind you that if you're, as you're listening, if you have questions, be sure to write them down on the piece of paper, and in just a little while we're all going to be sitting over there and try to answer as many of your questions as we can. And I just want to say again thank you to you, Erin, for caring enough to share what you're learning with all of us in a way that we can take it in, whether it's through Twitter or whether it's through you talking to us, because, again, that's another way of shifting the power, I think, to put power into the hands of all of us. And also to say that when you do your research, that you collaborate and co-create with people with lived experience. That's what I've learned just from short conversations with you, and because you value obviously who the real experts are in the room. So thank you for that.